Great, well, hello everyone. Really nice to see you. What a beautiful evening, suddenly. My name's Hadrian Garrard. I'm the director of the William Morris Gallery, and you're all very, very welcome this evening. So, order of service for today. If you hear a fire alarm, there are exits here, and that way, and we gather at the front of the building. All right. So we're going to talk for about 45 minutes. Then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. The gallery is remaining open for the evening, so please explore the building. We have our Mingay Art Without Heroes exhibition on in this temporary exhibition space and upstairs, and I would encourage you to do that. The shop is open, the bar is open, and we have the opportunity for some book signings after the talk. So that's a bit of admin. So I'm going to introduce our two special guests for this evening. So Olivia Laing is a widely acclaimed writer and critic. She's the author of, I'm going to say 8 books, because it said 7 here and it didn't include your latest. 7 books, including To the River, The Trip to Echo Spring, The Lonely City, and Everybody, and more recently, The Garden Against Time. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and in 2018 was awarded the Wingham Campbell Prize for Non-Fiction. Her books have been translated into 21 languages. Olivia writes on art and culture for The Guardian, The Financial Times, and The New York Times, among many other publications. She's written catalogue essays on a variety of contemporary artists, including Andy Warhol, Agnes Martin, Derek Jarman, and Wolfgang Tillmans. Her collected essays on art, Funny Weather, Art in an Emergency, were published in 2020. Next to Olivia, we have Jeremy Deller. Jeremy studied art history at the Courtauld Institute and at Sussex University. He won the Turner Prize in 2004 for his work Memory Bucket and represented Britain in the 55th Venice Biennale in 2013. And we were very happy to host that show, English Magic, in the year after that, which was great. His many projects over the past 2 decades, such as Battle of Orgreave, We're Here Because We're Here, as well as the documentary Everybody in the Place, An Incomplete History of Britain, 1984 to 1992, have influenced the conventional map of contemporary art. In 2015, he curated the exhibition Love is Enough, William Morris and Andy Warhol at Modern Art Oxford, which brought together iconic and rarely seen works by 2 giants of the 19th and 20th centuries. And we're going to have a conversation. I'll ask you questions, you'll interrupt me, and you can ask each other questions, all kinds of things. I had a really nice evening last night, Olivia. I've read your latest book. I really enjoyed it, The Garden Against Time, and I was having a refresh last night, which was a really enjoyable evening. I'm quite new to gardening myself. I started a garden about 9 months ago in the autumn for the first time ever, and I tried to read about gardening. I tried a bit of Beth Chatto, but my Latin wasn't up to it. Didn't really. But I had read Modern Nature by Derek Jarman, and when I read your book, it kind of felt like this similar experience in that sense. And you say in your book that it's hard to tack between worlds, and I think what you do in your book is you manage to garden through the book. So the book is you making or restoring this garden in Suffolk, but then it feels like your mind is going to lots of different places in time and in memory. And I learned a lot. I really did learn a lot. I mean, you cover Quakerism, the Levellers, Derek Jarman, Milton, the Flintstones on the way. And I was wondering whether your experience of gardening is that of a kind of, it's work, but it enables your mind to go to lots of different places, because that's kind of how it felt when I was reading the book.
Oh, that's a brilliant question. Yeah, I think it does. I think there's all kinds of different ways you can talk about gardening, and there's a story about gardening which is about ownership, which is about possessing land and creating landscapes of power or landscapes of a particular kind of beauty, and I'm not very interested in that. So the sort of gardening that I have wanted to do throughout my life is very inflected by Derek Jarman's creations on the beach, A Dungeness, and very inflected by the environmental activism that I was involved in the 90s, which was all about guerrilla gardening, making gardenings in waste grounds. So it always had a relationship with radicalism. It always had a relationship with a sense that it was related to wanting to reclaim land. It was about wanting to make relationship with land that had gone into private hands and wanting to restore that sort of commons tradition and create beauty. And I think that's why Morris emerges as such a huge figure in the book, because although he obviously is from wealthy origins, to look at this house, which was his childhood home, he nonetheless had that very political sense of what gardens were and what gardens could do.
I'm really interested in the labour of gardening and work, and Morris talks about
good work,
joy in labour, that work should be pleasurable and not trapping in the sense that you're not free to either express yourself or to think.
Yeah, I was going to say more about that because I realised I didn't actually answer your first question, which is gardening is a really interesting way to think, and I thought about it more and more as a kind of parallel activity to writing, because it's two things in one. You are creating a structure, you're creating something that's architectural and a design when you're making a garden, and then there's the dailiness of it. There's the dailiness of the labour, there's going out and weeding and pruning and shaping. And that is basically exactly the same thing that I'm doing as a writer, which I hadn't really realised until I was coming back and forth each day between the two tasks, that with the book, I lay out a structure really formally in the same way that I lay out a garden. There's discrete rooms, there's discrete chapters, things are going to happen in those spaces, they have atmospheres that are their own. Then you move to somewhere else and that has its own identity. But the dailiness of it, the sense that you're going around with your secateurs and cutting things out that don't work, I'd do that in the morning, then I'd come back in and I'd open my laptop, and I'd do exactly the same thing with the Word document. There was this sense that the work of editing is really similar. And I think part of the thinking that happens in a garden happens because it's an immersive and super rich environment. There's a lot happening in it. You're pulled into a present moment. I spent a lot of time humming the Flintstones, going over old grievances. I mean, I spend hours every day going over old grievances, but eventually they drop away, and then there's a different sort of flow-based state in which ideas emerge, and it feels like it's got a really fertile relationship to writing. Jeremy apparently hates gardening, is the revelation that I discovered upstairs.
No, I don't have a garden. I don't hate it. I just don't have one.
Pots could be had by anyone.
In the flat where I live, my partner does the pots, as it were. But no, I don't.
Should we talk about not having a garden? Because one of the things you say quite early on in your book is that it's about inequality of access, and that I think there's a number which is, if you're unemployed, you work in casual labour or sort of manual labour in Britain, let's say, you're 3 times as likely to have access to a garden than if you worked in a sort of professional...
3 times less likely.
Less likely than if you're middle class.
Yeah. That said, figures of garden ownership in England are astonishing. It is really high how much access we have in this country to gardens, but it is completely about class, it's completely about money, and it's completely about race. So that was one of the things that I really wanted to unpick. And when I was writing this book, it was the beginning of the pandemic. So it was incredibly large across the nation that some people were sitting on their deck chairs, sending photos of their roses to Instagram. And some people had no access to gardens at the same time that public parks were closed, wild spaces were closed. So, that is the current 21st century manifestation of what I wanted to draw through history, which is the long process by which the common ground has been taken into private ownership.
And here we're sitting in what was a private garden that included a medieval moat that was gifted to the people of Walthamstow in the 1930s, which was a kind of magical moment in time, and here we are all able to access it. Jeremy, I went on your Kinder Scout wander a few years ago in near Edale in Derbyshire, and you return to issues around land access and also more widely our relationship with land culturally time and time again. Could you talk a bit about what your thinking is around landscape and land being a kind of cultural site and how important you might think that is? Because I think one of the things Morris cared deeply about was a relationship with nature as a human right, let's say.
Yeah, and I think maybe because of lockdown, talking about lockdown, maybe not having a garden must have become a metric for inequality if you didn't have outside space, even a tiny amount of outside space. But just going back to that, I think that's really important. Because I was in a flat and I didn't have anything, so you're just looking out a window most of the time. And so I think that is really important. But yes, I did a project with the National Trust of sites around the UK, landscapes where things had happened, political events had happened that had maybe changed Britain in some way, but they were just landscapes. You didn't really know what had happened on them. It had to be articulated in some way. And Kinder Scout obviously is the great mass trespass. I can't remember the date now. It's terrible to say that. Maybe 1932, maybe around then, which eventually led to the setting up of national parks. That one event. But actually, if you go to that area now, it's still full of grouse moors and full of shooting, and the landscape is still very much degraded by that activity. So it's an ongoing thing. You can't just pat yourself on the back thinking we set up a national park, work is done, because it really isn't. And we had an event at the local village in Edale, and I didn't tell the National Trust, but I invited someone who's the top person in Britain, basically, a guy called Mark Avery, who writes about grouse moors. And he turned up unannounced to talk about that in a room full of gamekeepers, basically. And it was quite a sort of scene happened. But he stood his ground and he knows his stuff. So he could handle himself, but it did get quite interesting because people weren't expecting that at a village fair. But it was called Radical Landscapes, and I think a lot of cultural bodies, they like to talk about radicality and landscapes or whatever, and then when it actually happens on their watch at a village fair, they get very upset. But it is something that's ongoing, isn't it? It hasn't finished. We're still dealing with it.
One of the sort of resonances between this Japanese folk art exhibition we have now, which sort of looks at craft in Japan in the 1920s and 30s, which is when you see people leaving rural communities in Japan and moving to big cities. So it's a sort of slightly later industrialization process. So it's looking at the lost skills, the lost crafts, the lost cultures at that time, and a movement to try and reclaim them, or not let them die, let's say, in the same way. And it's a great show, you should come, it's free. It makes me think a little bit about your other project, which I really return to a lot, which is the folk archive, and this literal archiving of rural traditions, some of them funny, some of them deeply serious and spiritual, some of them going back thousands of years. So going back to the other question about the land and nature as a site as a cultural site and the potential loss of that, is there anything you wanted to say about that?
Yeah, it was about folk art and how you might want to redefine it at the end of the millennium, basically. We did a show in 2000 and then one in 2004, but it was really about our relationship to vernacular art, made in cities but also in the countryside. So there's traditional, what you might call traditional arts and performance, and then things that have sprung up recently. And for me, I knew that contemporary artists are very much inspired by folk art. And sometimes it's not given its due, especially in performance. And so we did this exhibition, myself and my colleague Alan Kane, in 2004 at the Barbican. And the response from the critics was unbelievably negative. It was like, one actually said, "I can't believe I've been asked to review this rubbish."
People hate folk art.
Well, they did then. Well, the critics did, because I think they were still the gatekeepers for taste in Britain in 2004. It was pre, the internet really taking over and people having their own opinion, being able to say it online. And so the critics were almost overwhelmingly negative, but the public loved it. It was an incredibly popular show. But now you wouldn't have that, because folk art and folk culture is looked at very differently. It might be to do with the kind of anxieties around who are we, because of Brexit and so on, people trying to reinvent things or say, well, we don't want to go to the far right. We want these for ourselves, actually. There's that element as well, I think.
Let's stay with access for a bit longer. One of the quotes that you reminded me of in your book, Olivia, was Derek Jarman in Modern Age, saying the Middle Ages have fed the paradise of my imagination. And of course, Morris turns to the Middle Ages. Ruskin talks about the Middle Ages being the last time where people had the kind of relationship with land that we should be having in terms of pre-enclosures, people living more freely with a relationship with land that's very different to one of privatisation and ownership. One of the things I enjoy about my little garden is thinking about time differently, and I'm finding it really healing, because I feel like I've been trapped in like this sort of school term mentality since I was like 12. I'm quite old now. And the Monday to Friday, the annual one, and that's kind of it. But what the garden is doing for me is it's just breaking that apart and making me thinking about a 4-year cycle before I'll get any cherries on that tree, and a much shorter. So it's making me think about time in really different ways. And one of the things your book does is that it's a bit of a time travelling experience, I feel. Can you talk about time a bit? That was not really a question. It's like one of those questions is not a question.
But yeah, I mean, it's called The Garden Against Time for a reason, and it isn't just that it's the garden through time, as in I'm looking at gardens from the sort of medieval period on. It is about this sense that the garden takes you into a different kind of time. The garden is an anti-capitalist clock. That's what I started to think, that, you know, I was writing these very political books like Crudo that were about being trapped in late capitalist time, but also the time of the internet, which is this constant present moment, but a present moment that brings you bad warnings of the future, which constantly are replaced by new bad warnings of the future. So you never have any time to digest, you never have any time to think through. You're just faced by catastrophe, but that catastrophe is followed by a new catastrophe and then a new catastrophe, which I find obliterating in terms of thought. I find it impossible to respond to it, and I feel like I become more and more trapped in this sense of numb horror. And so for the last few years, all of my work has been invested in trying to think of a way out of that, a way to respond to that that takes you somewhere different. And I think the thing about the garden is it's now all at once, but it's a different kind of now all at once. It's giving you information about the present moment, but also, like you say, it's a cyclical clock. Some of its cycles are very long, some of its cycles are incredibly short. And most importantly of all, the Garden of Eden that we're all obsessed with, that comes from the Bible, that creates our sort of pattern of what is good, is a crazy garden because it's a garden that is in fruit and flower simultaneously. It's a garden that provides all of your needs. And I think that is the garden that capitalism fell in love with. That's the garden of strawberries at Christmas. That's the garden of permanent abundance that comes at a secret, hidden, and incredibly painful cost to the environment. And the garden itself, working in a garden, you're forced to realise that that's impossible. You're forced to realise that things die in front of you all the time, that you have to wait, you have to be patient, you have to feed and nurture, you have to accept moments of decay. So I think for me, it became a way of resisting the mindset that leads to climate change. I think there are also ways in which the garden is an antidote to climate change, but in terms of time, it really draws you into kind of deep thinking.
And I think for me, yes, with climate change, but also just with patterns of working and patterns of labour, which are rigid, which are, you clock in, you clock out, and it's helping me sort of break out of that mentally in some way. And I think going back to this thing about work, like if there's one thing, which
Morris is obsessed with, is finding a way in which you can work, not just you, the glorified artist figure in the culture, but you, everyone, can find a way of working that's about love and pleasure as well as production.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And he comes back to work again and again and again. And I think, but it's really nicely entwined with nature. It's weird. It's like and art is entwined entirely with nature. and work, and it's kind of wonderful, and it feels very organic in that sort of sense. You mentioned Eden. Let's talk about paradise a bit, if we can. So Morris is someone that he wrote a book called News from Nowhere, which is still a Penguin classic. It's a good read. We
really
talk
good.
about that. You reminded me again. You should
Must be in the shop somewhere.
It's in the shop.
It's in the shop. Why don't you buy it?
We'll sign it afterwards.
So we'll do a left-hand signature. And again, I was reminded that one of the things that happens in News from Nowhere, which is, even if you haven't read it, it's Morris kind of wakes up and there's been a big revolution, and it's
24.
24.
It's not 24. And there hasn't been a big revolution.
And London doesn't look like London. The river, the Thames flows clear. There's no chimneys pouring out smoke. People seem happy.
Everyone laughed at that idea.
Yeah, and there's no money. There's a memory of the revolution, but people aren't really overly concerned with it, and people live in harmony with nature.
Everyone's really good looking as well.
Especially the women.
Hot.
Yeah, and the men as well. It's quite interesting.
And the men hot too, actually.
Yeah.
And there's some things that I'd forgotten that happened in that book that I again was reminded of. So one of them is that Trafalgar Square is an apricot orchard, which I think's probably quite possible now, given the
And
way
Parliament is a dump, isn't it? It's literally all the rubbish is dumped. Dung heap. Yeah.
So you talk about Eden and paradise, but you also talk about the origin of what we understand the word paradise to mean. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think there's a really nice link back to Morris through that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, good Catholic child that I was, I assumed that paradise was heaven up in the sky. But as I was sort of digging into etymology for this book, I thought, well, I'll look up paradise, such an interesting and powerful word. And it turns out it comes from ancient Persian, and it literally means a walled garden. So this is a concept that's in operation way before Christianity, and the word itself migrates through languages, and when people come to write the Bible, they use this word for a walled garden to sort of metaphorically describe heaven. So it flips it round. We don't think, oh, a garden is beautiful like heaven. We actually think heaven is beautiful. It's kind of like a garden, because a garden to our species is this sort of epitome of beauty, generosity, abundance, pleasure. It's not a farm. It's not just about your needs being met. It's a place that is about a sort of overflow of delight. It's art plus nature, which I think is what attracts Morris to it.
And I think there's a sort of tangential kind of link that hasn't really been written about much, which is Morris's own relationship with art from the Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire,
which is your next
Iran,
show.
which is our next show, which is not a plug. But it's interesting to me that Morris, who is someone that returns to utopia, to paradise, to this idea of creating a kind of something that's quite perfect in its own way, whether that's within a pattern or in a corner of your room, that this idea that you can create this little bit of paradise for yourself.
He would have known that idea about gardens. There's no way he wouldn't have known that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was a great connoisseur of that art.
Yeah.
And those carpets are like gardens, aren't they? That he was collecting and advising the V&A on. So he would have absolutely known about that tradition and wanted to imitate it, basically.
Yeah, and he talks about Persia being a holy land for pattern makers, and in his own home, what he had in his house was, as you say, were Ottoman velvets, Iranian metalwork, Iznik tiles. That's what he
famously
lived with.
he had a carpet on his walls, didn't he? It was
Yeah.
hanging from his wall. He didn't have it on the floor.
So the most British when you think about Morris, you think of him as such a British designer. He's deeply inspired, both kind of, let's say, spiritually, but also technically by art from from the Middle East, from what we might term the Islamic world, which...
And actually, even the medieval stuff also is so inflected by that. That sense of the sort of fluent repeating design clearly comes from the Middle East. So even the things that seem most English about him, I think, actually aren't.
Yeah, so it's a biggie, and so one of the objects we're borrowing for this show is the Ottoman velvet that they put on Morris's coffin when he died in Kelmscott Manor. So that object's...
What happened?
Just wanked into the...
Fuck.
It's the spirit of Morris.
Yes. Trying to enter the room.
Dear.
Break down the barrier.
There's a member of staff that could go and see to the pigeon.
No, it flew off. It's all right.
It's all right.
It's okay.
fine.
It's
That doesn't happen, so that's not a regular occurrence, I must say. So you made a T-shirt that says William Morris was right, and was right. And then you, in your book, Olivia, say if Morris saw in the industrialised, stratified, and exploitative world of Victorians sordid, aimless, ugly confusion, the dull squalor of civilization, imagine what he'd make of the present day.
I think he'd be fascinated by the present day, wouldn't he? He'd be horrified, and yet he'd be fascinated by light switches and phones and technology and what it's done for people. And I think he'd be just very, very curious about what we've become and the relationships between people. I don't think he'd be horrified, carte blanche. Things would horrify him, but I think he'd be very fascinated by what he saw and would be interested in it. So it's an interesting thought, isn't it? And I think a lot of what we see now around us is indebted to him. I even think the iPhone is basically a William Morris sort of. You can trace from Morris to the iPhone. You could do something definitely through modernism, and you make something that's beautiful, functional. But also, I don't know if you're aware. I saw something about the iPhones inside. They're beautifully made inside. They look really lovely inside with all the workings in a way that most electronic equipment doesn't. Mm-hmm. And that's the designer thinking about the insides of something and how it works and so on. So I think he's everywhere, basically.
And they're made in factories by children, which actually a lot of Morris things were. Which is the sort of, he's not perfect, Morris.
No.
And I think that's really interesting. Can I say something about that?
You can, but I'm going to challenge you on how mean you were about Merton Abbey factory a bit, but go on.
Well, I think we're in a sort of moment culturally where we're obsessed with purity and having heroes that are totally pure. And Morris isn't. Morris isn't that person. His income that allowed him to do all of this beautiful, interesting and utopian work comes from incredibly ecologically deleterious minds. His own factories did have, if not child labour, teenage labour. They weren't particularly nice places to work, though they looked beautiful and picturesque. And he answered that. People said that to him in his own lifetime, and he answered it in a way that I think remains true, that he said, you can't have socialism in a corner. What is needed is a total... And he talks about it in these sort of actually quite violent terms, smashing of the rivets of this chain that wraps globally around this sort of lacerating chain of global capitalism. What's the point of having some little fantasy community that lives outside of that? That isn't doing anything. And I think that actually, to me, makes Morris a really interesting figure and is really tough-minded about the level and degree of change that's needed. And I think it's really interesting that Morris is really hidden from view. That isn't the Morris that people talk about when they're talking about lovely, benign William Morris. There's a tough person who wanted a revolution.
He was tough. I think his factory in Merton Abbey wasn't that bad.
It wasn't as bad as other people's factories, but it wasn't...
It wasn't a factory as it might be. So it wasn't the factory he describes in that essay, which is a factory that has artwork on the walls, playgrounds in the garden, fresh air flowing through it, and people choosing to do what kind of job in the factory they'd like to do.
Yeah.
But he did have very good apprentices, and they were very young. So yeah, we had 12, 13-year-old boys that would work in the factory. he did move towards natural dyes. I'm defending Morris a bit because
all of these things are good, but I think it's important. But I think it's important
he was a capitalist, right? So, and I think the paradox with one of the bigger paradoxes for me with Morris is who could afford to buy Morris's products, and how increasingly uncomfortable he became with the fact that if you walk into the Oxford Street shop to buy some wallpaper, you're probably going to be, quite
But this
wealthy.
is the point where he sort of dives passionately into not just socialism but communism. This is the point where he suddenly thinks it's untenable. What I'm doing is untenable, and switches from becoming somebody who makes beautiful wallpapers for the very wealthy to somebody who is promulgating a kind of revolution. And this, I wanted to ask you about the Orgreave stuff, because I think you get this new Morris in his 40s who's suddenly turning up at demos, he's standing on carts giving speeches, and he's witnessing police violence. He's seeing things that are really, he sees a death.
Yeah. I think what happened to him, one thing that happened to Morris was he spent a lot of time with very rich people, which did his head in, basically. Like royalty, and then American robber barons and their families and so on. And I think it must have just sent him mad having to deal with people like that and be their client.
You've talked about that as an artist, haven't you?
Yes. And I think it does, I think rich people are different. They have opinions that aren't yours often, and they're quite happy to tell you their opinions and think that you're just going to agree with them. And I'm sure in that time, especially with deference being the order of the day, they just saw him as the designer that's coming in to do their whole St. James's Palace or wherever it is. Yeah. And it must have sent him nuts having to deal with these sort of idiots, basically, who had money. Yeah. And he basically said that, didn't he, a lot of the time? He just wanted to chuck out everything in their houses, and they have such terrible taste. So I think that he saw that, and then he saw the demonstrations, and he toured the country going to working men's clubs, or not working men's clubs as such, but these educational establishments and factories giving talks. So he saw the whole spectrum of life in Britain, in the way probably Dickens did as well. Mm-hmm. So in a sense...
He sounded like Dickens, I think.
Yeah. This sort
at that point.
This kind of epic sort of view of the country that he had, and of mankind almost, you could say, that Dickens had.
There's a really touching, I'm not going to be able to quote it, but there's a really touching line that he writes late where he's sort of becoming increasingly haunted by the sense of the total randomness that means that he has been born into this life of kind of pleasure and luxury, and other people wandering down the street outside his house in Hammersmith have completely different lines, and he sees it as just this randomness of birth that needs to be structurally resisted. And that's a very different Morris to the Morris that's sort of fairly dreaming of paradise. They're related, but he changes.
I quite like the way you describe Morris as becoming less thick-skinned as he gets older. So you talk about Jenny, his oldest daughter, her epilepsy. Janie. Well, Janie's the one I wanted to kind of focus on. So Janie moves into Kelmscott Manor with Rossetti, who was one of his oldest friends, who introduced them, and they have an open marriage in Victorian England. Is it Oxfordshire? I don't know, out there. And what does Morris do? This is my own reading of some of that. He goes, I'm fine, it's all right, I'm going to go to Iceland, right?
I love the sagas.
Yeah, and he goes to Iceland, which is quite a hard place to get to. He goes on a postal boat, it's rocky, and
he does it twice.
He goes twice. And the first time he goes there for 3 months, and he wanders around Iceland, and he writes letters, about rocks, about waterfalls, about the land, and not about his feelings. And he doesn't talk about his feelings in the written, kind of ever, let's say. Very, very, very light on feelings.
Which I think is sublimated into all kinds of...
The kind of... In the pleasure and joy of the wallpapers and those designs were very fecund, if I can use that fantastic word, but they're very about reproduction and sort of, I wouldn't say sexual, but they're sensual.
Terror of fertility and reproduction, because there's something frightening about them too. I think this is the power we pick up of Morris's work, even if you don't particularly like it, there's a sense that there's a deep emotional power in it.
Can I finish my Iceland reading of
Yes,
Morris's
sorry.
behaviour? It's quite good. I like this one. So he's in Iceland, he's wandering around, he's looking at the bogs, he's looking at the rocks, he gets on a horse. He's writing very vanilla letters saying, I saw a horse. You know, they're quite... I was going to read the letters, they're so pedestrian. Anyway, and he's having this Gothic experience. So he's there going, what is a man in a landscape? You know, I can see rocks, I can see the beginning of the world, right, in Iceland. So you can see the plates, you can see... that's how the world started, you see it in Iceland. He's doing that. His wife's with Rossetti, and he comes back a revolutionary socialist, and he's going, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to the unfairness of everything around me. And that's my own...
You've just made him sound like a men's rights activist.
Well, no, he's always concerned with what's fair and what's you know, things that are fair and that aren't fair, and what's not right and what's right. And he doesn't stop creating. He carries on making books. He carries on designing. The factories don't grind to a halt. But he dedicates most, let's say, of his energy to travelling around and talking about making things fairer for people, which I find quite interesting.
But he may have seen in Iceland people living a kind of medieval life, and thought, oh, you can do this in a society, in a country. I mean, I don't know what the population was like then, it must have been tiny, but he might have felt he's gone back in time, actually, as well as deep time, just gone back 500 years or 300 years.
It's a big part of why I wanted to go and see the reality of medieval kind of living on land in different ways, He's an interesting man. He's an interesting
man.
And we won't go straight back to gardening, but and I'm interested in how. Like,
but wait, Can I just ask my Orgreave question?
Yes, sorry.
What did you think would happen when you did the Orgreave reconstruction?
I should explain what it was.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll explain this in 20 seconds. What the thing was? It was a reconstruction of a battle from the miners' strike that had happened in 1984, which you will see whenever you see any footage of the miners' strike. You'll see this footage basically, and when it's ever mentioned, it's a huge battle between striking miners and the police that happened on a field. There might have been 15,000 people there, and I wanted to reconstruct it with members of reenactment societies and former miners who'd been there originally to go back to the place and remake it. So that's what I did. I had no idea what was going to happen.
What was your fantasy, though?
My fantasy was that, the reenactors were terrified, and their fantasy was that it was going to begin a world revolution, some of them. I can talk about that in a second, but I just wanted to see, it was like an experiment.
Were they playing the police?
Well, the reenactors
miners
were playing
miners.
Miners were playing themselves, and the reenactors were playing the police, but we did mix up a bit. But we had a rehearsal day, the day before, and the reenactors were absolutely terrified of the former miners, even though the reenactors outnumbered the former miners. They were very nervous. I'm feedbacking now. Can I just use that one? Maybe it go better. They were very nervous, and I think because they saw the former miners come back and at the rehearsal meet each other for the first time for maybe 16, 17 years, and they locked into this camaraderie which totally intimidated the miners. The reenactors who were playing. And the reenactors had never seen this sort of camaraderie, and they knew they were going to have to battle against these people. And it was this sort of love these men had for each other who'd been through this war, basically, for a year. And so I very ironically, the night before the events, the head of the reenactment societies, like I said, very ironically, threatened to go on strike if we went ahead with this sort of separation of former miners and the reenactors. So we had to mix people up even more. They were mixed up a bit, but they were just intimidated by these groups of men. Yeah, even though they were outnumbered, you could tell they were tight as a team almost. And it's something that reenactors don't have, because they're just people who sort of know each other from different walks of life. They hadn't gone through something like the miners had. So it was a social experiment, as best as I can put it.
The reason I was asking is because I think that Morris's experiences of protest were really fundamental for him, and I think everything I've written as a writer is really shaped by going through the experiences of road protest, Reclaim the Streets, all of those different movements that I was involved in the 90s, but particularly road protest, particularly that sense of how those protests were policed. And actually, it goes back further than that. It goes back to growing up in a gay family under Section 28, the AIDS crisis, those sort of politicising scenes that shape your perspective. And I think this is the experience that Morris could have avoided. He didn't have to live that life. He didn't have to have that revelation about who owns the country, who controls the country. He could have stayed on the side of ownership, and he crossed. And I think that's part of the sort of subversiveness of Morris that's so uncomfortable that people don't even want to talk about it now.
Bringing it back to Walthamstow a bit, Morris has gone.
I suppose people can't relate that element of his life to the beautiful objects he made, but I think you can. I think the designs, the wallpapers, the fabrics are actually an attack on the ugliness of the Industrial Revolution. It's like an aesthetic assault, and I think they're actually very political works. Yeah. Weirdly, and well, that's how I see them. And it's also just wanting to cover the world with that work as well, and for the garden to go indoors effectively, for nature to be inside as well.
I think that's really interesting. I think Peter Fuller writes about this in the 1980s, that in that ICA catalogue. He writes about, if you want to see the politics of Morris, you do need to look at the willow bough wallpaper and the honeysuckle chintz, because that's where perhaps some of his most enduring politics are, which are about, nature that's being eradicated, seeing things, looking at them, not living an ugly life, the beauty and the relationship with nature as a human right.
The power of the domestic.
Yeah.
That it's about the home environment, that it's about the idea that the home can be somewhere of beauty and not just retreat from work. That you can have a life that is work that isn't separated, work that is joyful. Yeah,
and an object that hasn't, even though Merton Abbey might not be the dream factory.
Of the highest possible standards.
It's not the highest possible standards, what hasn't been made through misery. And he talks about, why would you want an object, and that takes you to the iPhone, why would you want an object that's basically a result of exploitation and the people that were involved in making it trapped. The Walthamstow bit I was going to say is that we've got this great map from 1822, which is just sort of a bit before Morris's time, but of this area. And this whole London borough, when Morris lived in it, had about 2,000 people living here. It was rural, agricultural land. And in his lifetime, that 2,000 expanded to about 180,000 in his lifetime. So it was mass house building, encroachment of privatisation of land. And we've got letters, to the Evening Standard. He was part of the campaigns around Epping Forest being trimmed back and areas turned into golf courses. He was a very angry ecological campaigner as well as a socialist.
The Epping Forest stuff he's so angry about that in News for Nowhere there's a whole segue that's just rants about Epping Forest, which is not relevant to the plot at all. It's just like, let me tell you about Epping Forest.
And also the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, which he set up, which is kind of proto-National Trust and English heritage in a way.
Yeah.
So it's weird though, but with lockdown, if anyone was in London for lockdown and you cycled about, you couldn't really drive really, you weren't really meant to drive. It was probably the closest we're ever going to get to the News from Nowhere London. No cars, sort of depopulated.
Birdsong.
Yeah, exactly. You could hear nature, see it maybe a little bit more. Maybe it was becoming more unruly a little bit.
Yeah. I'm really interested in Morris's legacy and where it takes us. One of the films we showed for this Radical Landscape show was a Sarah Sender film, which was in the 1990s, of a Spiral Tribe rave taking place just round the corner from Kelmscott Manor, Morris's house, which was a really accidental, lovely thing. That this idea of being free outdoors, connected with land, and the fight back, let's say, it doesn't end, and it carries on. And Morris is someone that's really useful to look back on, and I think, and see a positive but quite complicated life in response to ideas around freedom and nature, let's say.
And the music festival and the sort of rave in the countryside is a form of idyll in itself, a form of paradise for people. If you think about what paradise in some cultures it is people hanging out in the countryside, and there's great food, and then there's someone giving a talk, and there's music, and all those things are available to you. And that's basically what a kind of a festival, music festival, has become, even though the reality is kind of a nightmare. But, you know, that's what they sort of sell. That sort of a paradise in the countryside. All the best things of the city life, but in the countryside. Yeah. Which is probably what he was trying to combine, the city and country at the same time, wasn't he, with his vision of London. And that's what we try and do when we go into the countryside, to socialise and be around people.
Can I ask another question? It's a segue question. When you did the thing with Morris and Warhol, did you find lots of commonalities between them?
I mean, it was a show about Warhol and Morris. Obviously, neither were alive in each other's lifetime and didn't know each other, clearly. But yeah, absolutely.
But oddly, sort of, actually, once you think of it, loads of similarities.
Tons in common. They're both printmakers. They're both interested in beauty. They both were ill as children and had a lot of time to themselves to create a sort of a land of like heroes and goddesses and gods. Some were in Hollywood for Warhol, and
versus the sort of Iceland myths. Yeah,
yes,
really
the medieval beautiful women and these heroic male figures. That's what Warhol was very interested in. That they're both obsessed with work and how do you work,
and productive in medium after medium after medium.
Yeah.
That sort of sense that they can just flow between different.
Exactly. There's no barrier between any. They could do whatever they wanted. They didn't see that they had to be confined. So
which I think, as an artist, is part of what's so inspiring about both of them, is you can just move. You don't have to be trapped in this different discipline.
Exactly. With Morris, there's so much more to know about him, isn't there? The more you know about him, you realise there's so much more to know. It's a career that is just so, like the work, is so fertile and full of meaning and profundity and beauty. And so is Warhol, really. Both very political artists, even though we don't think that. Both interested in money and commerce. Both loving printing things, making books, magazines. They were both of their time. In a way, Morris was he was really a contemporary artist, as we know them now. And he was maybe the first British conceptual contemporary artist, I would argue.
Yeah, and the means of production is something that is very much embedded in both of their practices.
The factory, as it should be, the factory. You know, how do you make the work?
Totally.
Yeah. How important is it? Who is there making work with you? And what's the environment like? And
can that be a convivial, life-based work making?
But it's not political, but it's what you believe in is what you have, the people you have around you, and this is what you make for yourself. Yeah. This is like your world you create for yourself in this room, all these rooms.
Well, I think that's one thing as a sort of William Morris type person, my job sort of William Morris stuff, is I'm always sort of very grateful to you, Jeremy, for your work, for kind of continuing to like bring Morris out of the kind of National Trust area into life, and thinking about how Morris does bounce around in contemporary ways. And also, to you, Olivia, in your book, I think your chapter on Morris is great, and I really learned a lot from it. I thought it was great, and I think the emotional reading of Morris and thinking about Morris as a person is something that's quite hard to do from a distance.
Actually, it's funny, because I did the same thing with Warhol in The Lonely City, and it's interesting that both of them, there's all this subterranean stuff around longing, around sexuality, around eroticism, around a sense of loss or grief, or not having quite got what they wanted from life, but then it's sublimated into this enormous productivity of flower picture after flower picture, both of them. I think it's really interesting to start thinking of them in parallel, because there's so much crossover.
And in my book, not what I'm selling my book, there is a section of quotes by Morris and Warhol, and it's a quiz. You've got to guess who said what, because they believe the same thing. Okay. They really do. Shall I read some out? Or not?
Have I got the book? Yeah.
You had it somewhere.
Hold on. Product placement. We're out of time, but we're just going to carry on for a bit, and then.
But we will have questions too, so think of your questions while Jeremy's paging through.
There's some great pictures of that show in that book too.
Yeah, we had a room of just flowers as well, because Warhol loved flowers and drew flowers and did prints of flowers, and we had Morris wallpaper with Warhol flower prints over it, and camo prints as well. He did a lot of camouflage prints. I can't find it.
Okay, I'm going to pad out because I've got something to say about flowers, because we were going to do this whole thing about flowers, and like Morris is really funny as well because there's things he really hates. He hates florists. It's one thing, and he hates ferns in gardens. He's like really particular about things that are right and wrong. He's quite funny about that. But the thing that I found is I was talking to my colleague Rowan Bain, who's like the authority on both May Morris, but also Morris's relationship with flowers.
Yeah.
And Morris drew flowers from memory. Like we don't like and
and he also wrote 10,000 lines of poetry on the bus to wind down.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever.
But isn't that mad? Like he didn't use a reference. He had the memory of like because he's Joe Ross and all that. But we have him drawing a
It's because
tulip
he couldn't
and crossing.
Google things, so he had a really good memory.
But those drawings, those big life-size panels that he drew with the repeats on it, are the greatest landscape paintings in Britain. It's not Turner and Constable. It's actually William Morris, I would argue. I've got a quote. Okay, you've got to guess who this is by. Whenever people in civilizations get degenerate and materialistic, they always point to their outward beauty and riches. Who is that, Morris or Warhol?
Should we do hands up for each?
That's really tough.
Who thinks? We do hands up. Who thinks that's Warhol?
Oh, half and half.
And Morris.
And Morris.
Just the rest. It's actually Andy Warhol. Machines, I have boundless faith in their capacity. It's William Morris.
See, I would have said Warhol, so I'm getting them all wrong.
I think having land and not ruining it is the most beautiful art that anybody could ever want to own. So, Andy Warhol.
Anyway,
Everyone's so shocked.
I think that's it.
Okay.
Is that a good place to go into
when I last did
questions?
that in public, I did it with the former director of this museum, and she got them all wrong.
So can I just say?
I've written books on both of them, and I got them all wrong.
I've got them all right.
Did you?
Yeah.
Did you?
And
Did you?
it's big film.
Scratch that tape.
Yeah. Is the pigeon okay? Yeah.
He's all right. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
If anyone would like to ask a question, we're not going to do roving mics, so you're going to have to project. That's a
But we can
caveat.
repeat it.
We can repeat it.
Mics.
There we are.
This is incredibly speculative, but I just think knowing that Scotland has got much better access to land than England and Wales, do you think that the new government might change that a bit? And if it is changed, do you think that's going to lead to more works of art in nature?
Did you hear that question?
Do you want to repeat it?
Well,
I think everyone heard it.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Will it change? I don't know. They might change it. I haven't really thought about it yet.
I'm sceptical that they'll do it, actually.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Is there any money in it?
They've started badger culling already, so I'm a bit depressed about them, to be honest. I don't think that they're big on land rights, actually, Labour at the moment. Yeah, sorry.
People have to struggle for anything.
People have to struggle for anything. That's our takeaway from tonight.
Hello, that's sort of linked, but there's a passage in your book towards the end where you talk about the kind of relentless growth that is the urge to push for in a garden and productivity and getting as much out as possible all the time, and the kind of cyclical nature of you have to have decay as part of life. And I was struck by the kind of parallels that I feel in life, in everything, where you have a period of work and you have to have a holiday, and you have a period of growth, and all of my lifetime it's been a rhetoric of growth, and we need growth, and it's this panic for growth, and I for one feel exhausted, but I'm curious about what you think in terms of this sudden break from the Conservative government, and are we having a break from growth?
No, we bloody aren't. And we bloody should be. That's such a good question, because no, they're besotted with growth. I have a lot to say about how much I currently despise Labour, despite being glad that they've got in. But one of the things that is really at the core of why I despise them is this obsession with growth, this obsession with business as the way out of the disasters that we're in. the belief still that trickle down is going to work, and I think it's really dismaying, and that somebody, possibly you, should send Keir Starmer news from nowhere right now.
I was going to give him a football shirt, but I can do both.
Oh, come on, you can do better than that, unless it's a William Morris football shirt. Jeremy, what
But
do you
as
think
a
about
word,
growth?
I mean, we think of growth with plants, don't we? And it's quite interesting that they use that word, because it's a friendly word for us, isn't it? It's a positive word. When actually what
But
they
permanent growth is a sick plant.
Yeah.
Growth that keeps growing and growing and growing is an obscene plant. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good question.
Thank you. Any other questions? We've got time for a couple, I think. Hello.
Hi. I'm struck by the fact that through, I suppose, really German romantics, through Heine, through Brecht, through Heaney, nature has been this lyric kind of opposition to politically demanding times. And that's a kind of continuum, I suppose, in Morris. With the present company accepted, who do you think today embodies that in either art or literature?
What is what?
Kind of politically
Charged
lyrical
landscape creation.
Yeah.
The politically engaged relationship with the countryside.
By being completely immersed in a kind of romantic nature as a political act.
Honestly, it's me and Jeremy.
It's just like present company not accepted.
And the pigeon.
I'm sure there's a lot of people, a lot of
There's
musicians.
so many people.
Yeah. I'll have to think about it.
But also, I mean, and that's all great, but I think, I can't remember which one of you said it earlier, but, you know, nature is always being weaponised by the right as well. The blood and soil rhetoric hasn't gone away. Our Green and Pleasant Land hasn't gone away. In fact, it's really interesting that Caroline Lucas has just written that book, Our Green and Pleasant Land, that's about trying to reclaim a sort of nationalism for the left or for environmentalists, because it's always being colonised and taken up by the right wing.
Also, I think it might not be individuals, but it might be institutions or groups of people doing something. I think looked at groups of people doing things. So I've been working with the Centre of Alternative Technology in Wales, where they make buildings from traditional materials, you know, from literally from pressed earth and mud and straw and bales and all sorts. It's amazing. So I think don't look at individuals, don't look to artists, look to groups of people who are making things in the real world. I think that's what's important.
But there is such a I mean, Wolfgang Tillmans, Joy Gregory, Ingrid Pollard, there's so many artists that are making stuff that's to do with landscape or thinking about post-colonial legacies of landscape, how we take over landscape, how we get it back into Guy Shrubsole, say. That I feel like it's an area that a lot of people are working in at the moment in exciting ways. Yeah, group-based and individual-based.
Probably more activists or activist groups. People like that, yeah.
How much do you think like the national malaise is to do with the deteriorating public realm? And
Totally.
right, can you talk a bit about that? And do you think that's my question? Because it all looks shit, doesn't it?
Oh, well, yeah, I do have a specific thing to say about that. Because I think I came away from this book feeling like the answer isn't about private gardens, it's about a patchwork of public and private gardens. And we know what big urban gardens can do. They lower the temperature of cities better than even planting trees. They have all of these effects on mental health and on physical health. But what I would like to see is a massive investment in apprenticeships to train, in very William Morris style, to train young people to become gardeners, to garden the public realm. And I think there's a way in which austerity has really hit parks, these sort of 19th century creations of, you know, generosity and uplift of people who don't have access, have been trashed, totally trashed by the 14 years of Tory rule. But there's a stealthy thing where people sort of say, oh, well, they're being rewilded. And that's absolutely bullshit. They're not being rewilded, they're being neglected, and those things aren't the same. So my sort of dream of what I would like to see from the new government is really that sense of investment in gardening as this thing that is, it's about biodiversity, it's about species-rich environments, but it's also about beauty, and the sense that beauty in our commons, beauty in our public realm, does good for all of us. It's not a luxury. It's something that's necessary in order for us all to feel that our public life is cared for.
Also, when was the last time that a new park was made or opened? I don't think that, I can't, you have museums are open, there's new museums and new, all sorts of, housing estates or whatever, but it's very rare you get a new park, a new piece of land is open to the public in an urban setting. It's almost unheard of, isn't it? But
maybe New Labour should have done that instead of opening all these weird art centres in cities.
Which are now ruins.
Which are now falling over.
But there are people who are doing that. There's Nigel Dunnett, who does these amazing projects. He did the Tower of London, he did the Olympics, but he also did this brilliant thing called Sheffield Grey to Green, and it's making totally beautiful gardens, but they're flood capture areas. They have all these sort of practical functions for cities, and I think that's the sort of future for garden making. Isn't about what are people doing in their grand designs backyards, but about how you can change cities with gardening.
Well, we're so lucky here because it's a bit like that Peter Fuller quote. If you want to find out Morris's politics, look at the patterns. We have all these kids' school trips coming here. I'm like, if you want to learn about William Morris, you need to go out there and look at those trees and just get involved. And we are very lucky in this place, and we're owned by a local authority, and so those sorts of questions of what's essential and what isn't are ongoing conversations, and we're saying access to nature and people feeling inspired and seeing things done well isn't a luxury.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but the council did want to close this place, I don't know how long ago, 10, 12 years ago. They did try and close it and change their mind.
Oh.
It's a good thing they changed their mind.
Of course.
Yes.
Because of public outcry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there we are. On it goes. Great. Well, I think that's a nice place to end. We're still open, literally, and we're open this evening. So we're not going to... Got another hour. So I would enjoy the terrace, the bar, and the shows and the books. And we're having book signings for both authors.
I'm not an author.
Both book people by the shop. So that will happen in about 10 minutes. Thank you all very much. Thanks.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you.